Begynd med at lå på gulvet. Okay.
Hello.
Say
Hello,
something.
hello. Is that,
Hello?
can you hear me at the back? Hello, hello. 1, 2. Louder? Oh no, we're good. We're good. I think we're good.
Hello?
What?
No, you've just got a strap. It's fine.
Ja, nu skal det gå alt kødets gang, og vi har et enkelt navn siddende i 2 stole, Ambrose Parry, og det skal være i samtale med Martin Jensen.
Thank you, and welcome. I'm looking forward to this. Chris Brookmeyer and Marissa Henchman writing as Ambrose Parry. And I was sent the book about a month and a half ago, and I opened it, and the first sentence I retranslate from Danish into English because I read in Danish is, no good story should start with a dead prostitute. My first reaction was, why the heck not?
I remember writing that line because I had endeavoured throughout all of my novels to not tell a story that started with a dead prostitute, and it was going to be a novel very much about the role of women in Victorian Edinburgh. But I realised there was no way of avoiding it. So there's an apology at the beginning. He says, and for that, apologies.
Okay. And the next thing I thought was, they must be convinced that this is a good story, and it is. I can really recommend it. It's a very good story. And how did it all start?
I think that's a question for Marissa. It was her fault.
Yes, it's really my fault. I am an anaesthetist by trade. I'm not a writer. I should probably say that from the beginning. And I took a year off work to do a master's degree in the history of medicine. And because I'm an anaesthetist, I was interested in the beginnings of anaesthesia. And I started researching a man called James Young Simpson. And he was such an interesting character. And I spoke to Chris about him, and Chris kept saying, I think there might be a book in this. And initially I thought that will never happen. But the more we discussed it, the more we thought that that was actually the case.
Well, I think that because Simpson's discovery changed medicine and changed surgery for the whole world.
We should probably say what it was he discovered.
Yeah, well, he discovered chloroform. So he essentially played this role in changing anaesthesia or creating anaesthesia, and we were, that on its own wouldn't have inspired me to think this was a story to tell. It was that he was such a warm and interesting human person. He was very, very much a family man, but he was also someone whose life and work transcended all the strata of Edinburgh society, from the poorest slums to the richest aristocrats. And when you've got something that spans society like that, it's a great way of exploring that society. So to me, it was just, as a writer, you're like a vampire. You're always looking for the next thing to suck the blood out of. And Marissa had served up the life of James Young Simpson.
But you said it was your fault. I would say it was our game then. And you just didn't say, all right, that's a good story, I'll write it. You invited Marissa, and Marissa said, no, this is my story. You have to let me in.
No, I think we did. I think originally we thought that I would provide the research and Chris would write it, but he had his own books to write, and I think what happened was I got fed up waiting for him, so I started, and then he came along and messed everything up and made it much darker and much more sinister, which I think is appropriate for the time that we're discussing.
Yeah, but I couldn't, I mean, I'd always wanted to write historical fiction, but I didn't have the time to research in depth. But it wasn't only that Marissa had done all the research, it was that Marissa had a perspective upon that research that other people would not have, because she had been an anaesthetist for 20 years. So material that someone else would have looked at and thought, that's interesting, that's not interesting, she knew where the drama lay. She knew what it was like to be a doctor in that story. So she took the story in directions that I would never have imagined. So it wasn't a question of her doing the research and me coming up with a story. It was really more about me trying to come up with a story that would allow us to explore the things that she had already written about.
So you started, and how do you work then? You must have had that question before.
Yes, and it is quite interesting because we come from two different backgrounds. So I always say that I'm a kind of fact person. I like the facts of the history, and Chris is obviously the writer. And so we had these different perspectives. I like to plan things, and Chris likes to be far more imaginative. And I think there was a bit of tension about that, because sometimes Chris would take the story in a direction that I hadn't anticipated, and I would ask, but how do you get to the end? And he would say, I don't know. And I would find that really difficult, but that's how he works. And he always says that obviously that's difficult for me, because as an anaesthetist, you never go into theatre and think, I'll just see what happens.
I'm sure we are quite a lot of people who are glad to hear that.
I mean, I think it took Marissa a long time to accept that she was just allowed to make things up. And once she accepted that, it liberated her in her writing. So we've written the second book, and it's exciting to see how much more expansive she has allowed herself to be. So, but even with the first book, what she was writing at the beginning was as if she needed to have a fact-based reason for everything she put in it. But by the end of the book, she was improvising a lot more.
So that's what you have learned. Yeah.
Yes.
What did you learn?
I've learned that there's a great value in actually thinking about it in advance, you know, in having a plan. Because my next novel, my next solo novel, instead of me thinking it up entirely alone, I thought it up in conjunction with Marissa, and she was invaluable in helping me develop the story. But because I developed it with a plan, it's far more intricate and probably a far better novel. So I've learned that although I do like to just see where the story takes me, there's a balance to be struck between planning and improvisation.
Yeah, we all know that.
I've also learned the importance of the extent to which an idea that sounds good in your own head, that it's maybe not as well thought out as you thought it was, because when you try and explain it to someone else, that's when you realise how many steps are missing. And we would have these discussions, and Marissa would say, where's the story going to go from here? And I would say, well, this is going to happen. And she'd say, how? And I would explain it, and that's when it was clear that I didn't really know how it was going to work out.
And before you started working together, did you read Chris's manuscripts before they were sent off?
Oh, yes.
So you knew his kind of work?
Yes.
Because I've always said that I was my own best critic until I married. And, and in my case, that is really true, because my wife reads everything I write the same day that I was writing. So you knew you knew how he was working, you knew how he wrote. And did you change it? Have you put your fingerprint on the language?
On his work?
In the book.
Oh,
is it his language, or is it yours, or is it?
Oh, it's interesting,
Brooks,
actually.
And is it Ambrose Parry's?
Well, it's really interesting, because the Ambrose Parry book was so different to the things that... Because Chris writes contemporary crime fiction, and this is a Victorian set, and Chris says that he always wanted to write a historical novel, but he had no interest in the Victorian period at all, because he felt that had been overdone in a lot of ways. But when we did decide to do this, we thought the voice of the book was so important, and we wanted to try and write in a kind of 19th century way. And it was quite difficult to do. It took a few attempts. And we found that the best way of doing it was for us to kind of rewrite each other's contributions so that it sounded consistent.
Marissa worked very, very hard for a long time on developing the voice. So she came up with the tone and the voice before I started writing my contribution. And what we wanted was to evoke a sense of the Victorian period, but without bogging the reader down in very, very complex Victorian language. But Marissa she'd sort of come up with this voice, which I was then able to imitate. But in my previous books, Marissa had always played a part in helping with the story. My first novel, which was called Quite Ugly One Morning, she came up with a plot of Quite Ugly One Morning, but she was very shy of telling people she'd come up with a plot because she was working as a doctor in Edinburgh at the time, and the plot involved clearing patients from beds in a hospital by murdering them. And as a doctor, you don't want to draw attention to the fact that this was going through your head.
It was satire.
Yeah, the book was a satire.
Yeah.
And people, well, I remember the book very well. I think I understood it was a satire, and hopefully the Scottish
not an instruction manual.
The Scottish audience understood it. And now I think just a few words about the book itself. It's about a young man, Will Raven, who starts as the apprentice of Dr. Simpson, and lives in his house. And in the house, he meets a young girl, Sarah Fisher, and from the beginning they don't really like each other, but we all guess that that's only in the beginning. Something is going to come out of this, of course, and I hope that sometime it will. And then you mix it with real people, real persons, people who have lived and worked, and having written quite a few historical novels myself, I think we sometimes have a problem because we use these real people as puppets. We make them do things, we make them say things, we make them have motives that we haven't the foggiest idea if they really had. One of your persons is not very likable. And I looked him up and I found, yes, he did live. Yes, he did live in the house of Dr. Simpson. Yes, he was there the night they all actually, they took chloroform and woke up the next morning. And it was kind of a eureka moment. Yes, this works, we can use it. Was he like that? Was he a very unlikable? Or did you make him?
I think there were aspects to his character that I think Chris has exaggerated for dramatic effect. He did fall out with Dr. Simpson over who was responsible for discovering the sample of chloroform. There was a lot of friction after that, and there was a lot of aspects of his character that I think you just exaggerated.
Oh, there was a character, his name was James Matthews Duncan, who was a brilliant young man who had graduated. He was given special dispensation to go to university when he was it?
He graduated at the age of 20, which was a year before he was supposed to.
See, he was very, very clever, but one of the things we wanted to explore in the book was that medicine is not always driven by altruistic motives. There's some very egotistical people go into it. And what Marissa found, that as a doctor, there's a lot of very bad behaviour by almost exclusively by men, which is excused on the grounds that they're brilliant. And I wanted to suggest that was this character's tendency, that he was very arrogant and very self-seeking. And reading between the lines, that's what I thought that was the type of person he would be. Mm-hmm. But he may have been a warm and lovely individual for all I know. But in order to tell a story, you sometimes have to create tension in places. There's no tension, there's no story if everybody gets along. Mm-hmm.
You said that they fell out because they quarreled about who invented chloroform. But as I remember, wasn't there an apothecary who was actually the first mover? Yeah. So they took it from him.
There was a man called David Waldie. Yes. Who was an apothecary who worked for the apothecaries in Liverpool, and he was really a chemist. And he suggested that they try chloroform in their experiments, looking for an anaesthetic agent. But that's all he had to do with it. But in subsequent years, he also became quite disgruntled that no one was thanking him for his contributions.
That's what I remember,
Yeah.
Although Waldie, to show just what a chaotic time it was Waldie may have suggested it, and he said he would send Simpson a sample, but he was a bit of a chaotic figure and managed to burn down his own laboratory, didn't he?
The laboratory went on fire. You're suggesting that it was his fault. Again, see, this is how he works.
And then I can't remember which parts were historical fact that Marissa uncovered and which parts I just decided were happening.
I think you should always have your facts right there. I'm speaking as a colleague.
Yeah, and that's my job.
Oh, good. Now you mentioned this the advantage of being a male person or being a man in that. There's quite some discussion of gender politics in the book, which they didn't discuss that in the Victorian ages, because they lived in a time where that was not on the agenda. But is that your influence or is it yours?
I think the Sarah Fisher character is an intelligent young woman who's a housemaid and gets very frustrated because she sees young men coming through the house being taught things she wants to learn. And we kind of developed it from there. But there's also a lot of feminism that was occurring at the time that we maybe don't know about. And in my research, I did uncover there was a lot of working class women's movements in the early 1800s that we don't hear about. We think that feminism maybe started with the suffragettes in the early 1900s, but there was a lot that we don't hear about that happened much earlier than that.
Because no historical phenomena just comes out of nothing.
Yes.
There must have been a flower bed before.
Yes.
And there's just coincidentally this week it was announced that Edinburgh University are going to have graduation ceremonies for the Edinburgh 7, who were the first 7 women allowed to study medicine at Edinburgh University. They were allowed to study, but they weren't allowed to graduate. And so 150 years later, they're going to be posthumously allowed to graduate. But we wanted to look at our vision is to have Sarah ultimately become one of the Edinburgh 7 in the story. So we wanted to look at the roots of women deciding they wanted to take part in medicine and the struggle that they had to get involved. So as you say, no such development just happens out of nowhere. It takes sometimes centuries, because there was the writing of Mary Wollstonecraft that. Is it Wollstonecraft?
Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft was 1790.
Yeah,
she was writing.
She was writing the Vindication of the Rights of Women. So that's 100 years before the Edinburgh 7.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Luckily, you don't have to stop here, because at 11:45 I'm talking to Marisa and Chris Brookmeyer and Ian Rankin in the tent, and there we'll concentrate on Edinburgh. The part that Edinburgh plays in the books of the 3 authors. You're signing at just after this, just around the corner. And if you hadn't had enough of Ambrose Parry or me, you can come at 11:45. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Og signeringen foregår over i Bog og Idés stand.